are needed. Next slide, please. This month, we explore one of the biggest questions facing our field: how to change social norms around child marriage and what roles can community-based organizations play. As a partnership of over 900 civil society organizations working across over 95 countries, at least 70% of our members identify as community-based organizations, and many of them are struggling with the question of what really works to change social norms around child marriage. As a partnership, one of our strategy goals is to make sure efforts to engage communities, families, and girls are supported and highlighted. So we have asked our members via a survey to tell us what would be the most useful so that the Secretariat can help with their work. And Suzanne will tell a bit more about that later. This is the first of 2 webinars exploring social norm this month. The next one will be on the 22nd of February, and we'll share lessons learned of ongoing initiatives to change social norms at community level. But it was important for us to start with this webinar to benefit from some of the great thinking that has been done on how social norms change. We hope it will give you a good introduction to the issues and what we know about how social norms change, and that it will help shape some of the conversation we want to have at our upcoming meeting in June. Next slide, please. So we will have 2 presentations and the question and answer session at the end of it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Suzanne Petroni, who's an expert around gender and social norms, who will be co-facilitating this webinar with me and will introduce the speakers. Suzanne, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Alessandra, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, folks. As Alessandra said, this is the first of 2 webinars that Girls Not Brides is hosting that will address social norms as they pertain to child marriage. And even more specifically, we're looking in these 2 webinars at how community-based interventions may work to shift social norms. Now, sometimes these community-based interventions take place in tandem with broader interventions, for example, mass media, television, radio, and or broader societal changes such as economic shifts that may affect social norms, but not always. So in today's webinar, we're going to lay the basis for more work that will be coming out not just in the webinar next week, but also over the coming months. We'll get a better understanding, hopefully, of what social norms are and what gender norms are, and how they may influence the practice of child marriage in different places. We'll touch on what the evidence says about how community-based interventions may work to shift social norms, including gender norms, and we'll also get a sense of some lessons learned and best practices that come out of the existing evidence base. For example, we'll learn that it's important to recognize that social norms both stem from and are specific to particular social contexts. And so understanding norms related to child marriage in a specific region or community is therefore a critical element of designing interventions that aim to shift social norms. But we'll also get a sense of why the evidence base in this area is not as deep as many of us would like. And largely this is because measuring social norms and shifts in social norms is quite challenging, especially when you're trying to attribute changes in social norms to any particular intervention. It's not as simple as measuring changes in knowledge, for example, or even practices. So we'll get an introduction to some of those challenges, and we'll also point you to some resources you can use to learn more about how to measure norm change effectively. Many of you have already responded to the survey that Alessandra mentioned that went out with the invitation to these webinars. So if you have done that, first, thank you. For those who haven't yet completed it, we would encourage you to do so by the end of next week. Because, as Alessandra indicated, Girls Not Brides will be doing additional work on community-based social norm change over the coming months, and we really want to gain a better understanding of what members are currently doing, how they're doing it, as well as what they want to learn, and so the responses to the survey can help us with that. Based on the survey results so far, though, we know that many of Girls Not Brides member organizations are, in fact, working to shift social norms around child marriage by engaging community groups and community leaders, far more than seem to be using mass media or education entertainment, for example, to do so. We also know from the results so far that through these social norm interventions, the majority of members are working to change people's knowledge and attitudes regarding child marriage as a primary outcome. That about half of these interventions are using specific tools or strategies to measure these changes, and that most of the organizations working to shift social norms interview community leaders and or girls to try to assess whether norm change has happened. And lastly, we can see from the results so far that many members are eager to learn more about how to design community-based programs to shift social norms and how to measure their impact. And that's great because that's exactly what we're going to start discussing today on this webinar and then next Thursday as well. So with that, by way of introduction, I'd like to turn it now over to our speakers. First, we'll hear from Dr. Caroline Harper, who leads a program on social development, gender, and generations at ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, based in London. And after Dr. Harper speaks, we'll go immediately to Dr. Anjalis Kohli, Deputy Director of the Passages Project at Georgetown University's Institute for Reproductive Health here in Washington, D.C., where I'm also located. Caroline and Anjali will each speak for about 10 minutes, leaving us 20 to 25 minutes for questions and answers. You should feel free to start writing any questions that you have in the comment box as we go along, or you can wait until after their presentations and then submit your questions in writing that way. So with that, I will ask Caroline to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandra and Suzanne, for the introductions. I'll press straight on with the presentation in the interest of time. So if you move through the slides. So I'll talk somewhat about definitions underlying social norms, given that many people are using these terms nowadays, and then look a little bit at the drivers of child marriage and the types of norm changes underway. Next slide. So in terms of the definitions, I think we're all aware that a lot of people are using this term social norms, but I see it being used in many different ways in different contexts. These are the definitions that we're currently working with, but I think that I've seen many flexible definitions according to the context in which you're working. So here, social norms are the often implicit and informal rules that most people accept and abide by. They're influenced by belief systems, perceptions of what others expect and do, and sometimes by perceived rewards and sanctions. They're embedded in formal and informal institutions and produced and reproduced through social interaction. And they change when sufficient people choose or are compelled to act in a different way. And then gender norms are social norms of masculinity or femininity that express the expected behavior of people of a particular gender and often age in a given social context. They often reflect and cement inequitable gender relations. If you move on to the next slide. I think what this is really trying to demonstrate is that social and gender norms are seen as the rules and expectations of how we should behave. This definition is influenced quite a lot from the disciplines of social psychology and behavioral science. And other people use the term norms in different ways, but this is the one that I think is most commonly used. The idea is that the rules and expectations of how we should behave, this is held in our minds and ourselves and our communities, but they're not necessarily created there, even if they seem normal to us. And the norms and rules are incorporated into a range of institutions, which either serve to reinforce them or may produce the rules in the first place. So religious institutions may co-create these rules as a form of control over social order. Customary law may enforce them, educational circumstances may support them, and economic drivers may emerge which maintain them. So there's a whole range of institutional contexts which either co-create or enforce the norms that individuals and communities hold. And those result in practices such as child marriage. Next slide, please. So if we look more closely at the norms and values per se, in fact, the norm is probably the understanding of the fear of a girl being what we put here as left on the shelf. But the types of behaviors which reinforce that are, for example, the belief in marriage and motherhood. This is a framework for the social acceptance that girls in girls' lives. Or puberty is often seen as a signal of readiness. And this is a very strong driver to the extent that belief systems are developed to suggest a girl must not menstruate in her natal home and she must be married before she menstruates. The idea of honor is very important. The shame of premarital pregnancy. This is also signaling a male and family control of a girl's body and her reproductive value. And all of this is packaged into a norm about this fear of being unmarried or left on the shelf if you're not married before you turn 20 or other ages, depending on the context. So those are the more intimate norm and value-based drivers of child marriage. Next slide. But there's other drivers which interact with these value-based norms. Because girls are often seen as an economic asset, they often move into the home of their new husbands, and the economic value is lost to their birth family. So economic factors drive child marriage a great deal, and this includes the perceived lost investment. So why educate a girl when she will benefit another household and family? There are other education-specific factors which play into early marriage, such as the fear of the loss of honor in the educational setting due to violence and harassment in school. Other factors such as the lack of paid work for girls post-school. So there are many different school-related factors that drive girls out of school and into marriage. And there's also the factor of girls' own agency within their own context. They want the social recognition of marriage and motherhood, and that is very normal to them. So there's an intersection of different norms and drivers which will end and result in child marriage. Next slide, please. This conceptual framework identifies the combination of forces from the individual agency and family through the wider drivers and specific contexts to either change or reinforce norms. And again, just to reiterate that norms are the rules we abide by. So it illustrates that change is not just up to an individual to change their mind, but involves a set of other powerful drivers that need to change alongside that. Next slide, please. So the key drivers, here are some specific change areas that seem to have worked in raising the age of marriage for girls. All of these we found, this piece of work is drawing on field work that was done in 4 countries by our partner national researchers in those countries, looking at remote rural girls and their circumstances around child marriage. Keeping girls in school clearly seemed to have a good delaying effect, but how to do that was part of the problem. Stipends for secondary school attendance seem to work, and in fact, from this and other work, it's quite clear that boys who are exposed to girls as academic partners in secondary school or tertiary education actually change their attitudes to the place of girls and women, and that's a very important driver. There was some evidence around media and edutainment type activities which the girls had seen. Legal sanctions in some places had actually been quite effective, fining families, but that was in some very specific circumstances. Access to government and NGO awareness campaigns in the communities we worked in had some effectiveness, but there weren't too many activities going on. Public health messages also seem to be quite important in those communities, explaining through the health services the advantages of delaying first childbirth. And mobile phone access had been very important for all of these girls, often actually driving early marriage. So it was not necessary, it hadn't been utilized to delay it. The girls were actually arranging a lot of meetings with boys, and it was driving some of the early marriage that was going on. So what the combination of these slides are speaking to is that action cannot just be focused on individuals and their immediate community to change the rules and expectations. We need that, but we also need attention to the wider drivers, such as economic, legal, educational contexts, and understanding how norms are embedded in a wide range of institutions and indeed created and controlled by those institutions. So from what I heard from what Suzanne just said in the introduction, there does seem to be a lot of attention both to the immediate rule holders in communities as well as to some of these wider factors. I think that's the end of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Anjali, you're next on the microphone.
Can you go to my side? Thank you for the opportunity to present. Just wait till you get to the next slide. I'm going to talk today about community-based normative change interventions focused on key attributes of interventions, lessons learned, and social norms measurement. The next slide, please. I'm just going to start with the definition of community-based normative change interventions. We define this in our programs at IRH as strategies designed to promote collective change by encouraging communities to reflect on and question social and cultural factors. The definition emphasizes that these interventions use strategies that are designed to promote collective change. And while this seems obvious in practice, it can often be confusing because some individual behavior change interventions focus on and include strategies that address individual attitudes and behaviors, but they do this at a community level through community awareness sessions and knowledge building sessions. So it's important when thinking about our theory of change and program design of whether we're really addressing individual attitudes and behaviors or community-based collective change. The second component of the definition on reflecting on questioning social and cultural factors, I'll get a little bit into in the next slide. So next slide, please. So how have programs engaged communities to shift social and gender norms? A recent literature review on social norm interventions found that there is no common definition or structure to these interventions, but they did identify some core components that are important to consider. First, it's important to identify norms upholding the behavior of interest. It's important to consider that norms that uphold the behavior in one setting may not be consistent across different geographies and cultures, and there are likely several norms that hold up a behavior. And a norm may be related to several behavioral outcomes. Identifying the norms that are most critical in catalyzing the change and to identify the network and reference groups that uphold, influence, or enforce norms and associated behaviors, therefore is essential in thinking about design of interventions. The second element is to be intentional. This means that social norms concepts should be integrated in program design, including thinking about how the program is designed to bring about normative change, how they envision each component addressing this, and then thinking about the monitoring and evaluation of the program from the start. The third point is to engage communities from the beginning. This means that programs need to be rooted in the community's value system for people to identify what is working and what isn't working and what they want for the future. Programs that try to leap over this process and identify harmful norms and behaviors for the community or to define new norms for the community often find that the community doesn't own or buy into the norm shift and the change that they're envisioning isn't realized. This also means thinking beyond the group that will directly benefit from a norm or an outcome shift to include those that influence, control, or determine the norm and the norm shift. Another component is emphasizing positive norms. So a lot of research is showing that focusing on the negative behavior or a harmful norm can unintentionally reinforce the behavior. It does this by increasing the visibility of the behavior, making it seem acceptable, normal, and expected, thus strengthening the norm. All communities also have positive norms and behaviors that can help start conversations to examine beliefs, practices, and a vision for the future. So how do we engage the collective? One step is critical reflection. This involves the use of a range of strategies. For example, we see this in the SASA program in Uganda, where the program promoted local advocacy in addition to a range of other strategies. And that included quick chats, soap opera discussions, community dramas, community conversations, personal reflection, and public dialogue. And they targeted individuals, families, friends, neighbors, stakeholders, and power holders that had an influential role in holding up norms and behaviors. This multi-level, multi-component strategy then was able to realize norm shift and behavior shift. Another component is to engage trusted, credible individuals to facilitate dialogue. These individuals are identified by the community and the groups of interest, and therefore may not be the same across different subgroups. Their role in the program is not to determine new norms or to highlight harmful norms or behaviors, but to facilitate reflection and dialogue in the community. Many projects also use positive role models that can help inspire change and model new behaviors, and they use safe, inclusive spaces to allow people to have facilitated discussion led by trusted, credible individuals. Lastly, what we've already said, multi-component, multi-level interventions are showing more promise in being effective in shifting norm change and behavior than our single-level interventions. Next slide, please.
Anjalis, would you mind speaking a bit closer to the microphone? I think some participants are having trouble understanding.
Oh, sure. Sure, I'll speak a little louder.
That's perfect. Thank you, and a bit more slowly.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Sure. So next slide. So I'm just going to talk briefly about this, but it's important to note that power and social norms are closely linked. Power is at the heart of social norms, and examining and addressing power is an essential component of a community-based normative change intervention. This also means that processes of social norm change may involve conflict and disagreement, especially if those with power think they have something to lose. We need to start thinking about this from the beginning when we're identifying the norms of interest and the power holders that hold those norms in place, and also defining the strategies to address these in the program and thinking about program monitoring. Next slide, please. It's important to note that not all norms matter for the behaviors of interest in the program, and not everything is a norm. So as we're thinking about social norms interventions, there are multiple components, as Carolyn said, that become very important in what's holding a behavior in place. Some of those may be normative and some may not. It's important to understand that the critical aspects that uphold behaviors, so, like I said, some of these may be normative, some of maybe not, and some norms may be more relevant to address than other norms. Next slide, please. So shifting norms will not change behavior if the power, economic, legal, and other structural factors are not in place to support the shift. For example, if communities place increased value on girls' education and gender equity, but access to schools is limited, behavior change cannot be realized. So even though we might be changing the norms in the community around gender equity, we might also be disempowering girls and women by not creating the access they need to schools. Next slide, please. So in our programming, we think of three critical questions as we start to design and develop our programs and monitoring systems. We look at who are the social reference groups that influence the health behavior, what are the social norms that influence this behavior, and what are the social norms that influence this behavior the most. And the third question is critical because you can't address all social norms, but certain ones may be more important than others for the behavior of interest. The answers to these questions influence how we design programs, the strategies we choose to use, and the people that we include in them. They also influence the complementary cross-sectoral strategies that we use to address norm and behavior change. Next slide, please. So here I've summarized 4 different phases that we think about when we're starting to look at identifying norms through developing interventions, monitoring evaluation systems, and then looking at sustaining and expanding normative programming. You can see here that there's different objectives for each phase and multiple ways of looking at how to collect information for these components. A lot of these different components are in different stages of development. There's a lot of organizations with really advanced thinking and how to identify and diagnose norms and then translate this into useful strategies for developing interventions and identifying who are the reference groups that are important to address. But this helps us come up with a systematic way in thinking about program design, especially related to community-based normative change. Next slide, please. So what are some key lessons learned from our community social norms programs? First, we know that shifting norms does not guarantee shifts in behavior. So this really places emphasis on the need to monitor and adjust programs as they go. We may be seeing changes in norms, but there may be many reasons why those norms are not leading to behavior change. Secondly, programs should monitor for unintended consequences. I'll just give a quick example. We see this sometimes from a study conducted in ODI in Uganda. We saw that girls' education had become more important as they started to address equity and gender equity, but they also saw that schools that did not have curriculum or teaching that was gender equitable could also be enhancing and reinforcing the harmful norms that the program was trying to address. And so it leads to this situation where cross-sectoral programming becomes even more important. So we're thinking more holistically about the ways in which norms are reinforced and developed across systems. Thirdly, some norms are sticky, and we often talk about this in relation to gender norms. And they're often sticky because they're based on deep-seated ideas of gender and gender relations and roles, are enforced by power holders, and are often considered normal or the regular state of things. And so these norms may require additional efforts to shift than other kinds of social norms. And lastly, norms are not static. So this means that communities that already have those positive social norms and behaviors can also shift towards negative social norms and behaviors. And so one example of this we see in settings of conflict and displacement, where communities that have moved into communities who are displaced sometimes have gone from lower levels of using child marriage as a strategy for their girls, or using child marriage, they start to increase the use of it because of the economic stability and instability in their household, because of the desire to protect their girls from experiencing violence in the community, and because of an effort to get them access to legal paperwork that they may not have access to if they're based in a refugee camp. So it's important also to be thinking about norms and to be monitoring for it in situations even when behaviors are already positive or norms seem to not be an issue. So I'll leave it at that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Caroline and Anjali. Very interesting presentations. So now it's question and answer time. So for the participants online, feel free to type any questions you have in the text box, and we'll do our best to address them. If we don't have time to address them all, we will answer all of your questions individually after the webinar. But let me just, start the Q&A session with a question to both our speakers. So let's start maybe with Caroline. So Caroline, what does the evidence shows regarding how social norm change can be scaled up from community level to district, state or regional level?
Well, thanks for the question. Interestingly, I was just at a meeting with a large number of social norm experts where scale up was one of the questions. And I don't think we have strong answers to that, particularly if you're starting at the community level. I think what the evidence is showing us is that because one needs to take action on multiple fronts at once, scale up is not necessarily from the community level to the next level to the next level, but actually changes in national educational curricula, changes in educational provision, changes in post-secondary school opportunities for girls, national level legal provision, which is clear and accessible so that women and girls can claim their rights, social justice in general, across multiple fronts, and that includes ensuring that women's movements and women's rights movements are well, flourishing ideally, but at least existing, are all factors which will drive what one might call scale up in terms of empowering girls in relation to their marriage prospects and what they want to do. Clearly, scaling up in relation to working with religious and community leaders is really important. The power holders are the people who can change. So if we're looking at scale up from, an individual wanting to aspire to something different, they can only do that if the power holders in their communities and networks are also accepting of that change. And so scale up in terms of working with religious groups and power holders locally is very important. And then finally, of course, working with men and boys, which, there are many groups that have good knowledge of that, but that's clearly very important.
Thanks. Anjali, would you like to complement that answer at all?
I don't really have much to add. I think Caroline covered everything. I guess the only thing I could say is at least in thinking about scale up within a community, in a lot of our programming, we think about how, make your tools and the design simple and clear from the beginning. So really engaging with the theory of change and trying to see how the different components of an intervention contribute to your overall objective and aim of changing behavior, so that you see the ways in which things are meant to interact and you can monitor for that. And then keeping things low cost and simple from the beginning, so that it's easy to take something that you've developed and start to translate it into a wider community base. But I think the larger institutions and other complementary things Caroline spoke very well about.
Okay, thank you both. Suzanne, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. So Caroline and Anjali are both involved in learning collaboratives, learning networks, learning platforms on social norms. And so I wanted to give you both an opportunity to tell us a little bit about Align, that is run by ODI, and the Learning Collaborative run by Georgetown Institute for Reproductive Health. And maybe help our folks on the webinar to understand how they can learn more and or participate in these networks if they are interested in both changing and measuring social norms. Caroline, do you want to start?
Sure. Yes, I'll introduce to the participants the Align platform. This is the platform was launched in November last year, and it's a project funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. As you can see on the screen, our intention is to enable and connect a global community of researchers and thought leaders to challenge and change harmful gender norms affecting adolescents and young adults. And this is through developing and sharing innovations. We want to advance understanding and ensure knowledge on norm change contributes to sustainable gender justice. So the project has various components. It has a digital platform on which we are curating content. It has convening functions and a small funding window. Next slide. This is the current front page. It is a platform in development, so we are gradually building up the resources on here. It is not a library of everything for everyone. We are trying to shape the learning as we see it amongst multiple communities. At the moment, we are building up the resources. So we have if you look at the top of that, a resource section with 40, 50 and more growing number of resources on gender norms and the best resources that we think help people to understand what norms are. But alongside that, we're curating areas of the platform. So we invite known experts to write 4, 5, 6 web pages on their particular area of expertise, such as education or health, or within that we're building out what we know about, say, curricular development or girls' clubs, with reference to norm change and what's worked in achieving norm change. So each of those curated areas enable you to do a deep dive into particular areas, but not without some guidance, because there is so much literature out there that it can be very perplexing. So gradually we're building out the knowledge areas. We also have a community area where we want to hear from people about what they would like to learn about. We have a news section which will advertise events that are going on, and we are linking with ongoing other initiatives, such as the one you will hear about shortly, the Learning Collaborative, but other big projects that are working on norm change. And we will have a project page as well to share project learning. We have a panel of experts that review submissions so that we can make sure that all the submissions that we actually profile are in line with our objectives. And we have a small funding window which is closed actually for this year. We've just closed it. And that's really to support new knowledge and innovation around norm change. Next slide. I've been through most of these. We will be holding some webinars. We have recommended readings. We will have audiovisual material and materials that we hope you can share with your colleagues. I think the content, the contact may be on the next page. Just to go to the next page. Yeah, so these are some key links and resources. The bottom one is the Align platform. The Unhappily Ever After paper is a policy paper specifically on child marriage. And then the one above that, Transforming the Lives of Adolescent Girls, is the 6-year project we ran working with adolescent girls in 4 countries. So those are just some materials to help everyone's thinking around this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. And Anjali, the Learning Collaborative?
Yeah, next slide, please. So I'll talk about the Learning Collaborative, which was launched at the end of 2016 and is also funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Next slide, please. So the Learning Collaborative is a collective of different organizations and practitioners working on social norms. And the founding participants developed this mission statement, agreeing to build knowledge and develop shared tools to promote effective social norms theory, measurement, and practice at scale. So we focus on adolescent sexual and reproductive health and normative change initiatives, but some of our materials and tools may be of use and interesting to people working on other issues. Next slide, please. So we have 3 components to our Learning Collaborative. This includes theory, measurement, and scale-up and costing. I mean, you can see here that each group has different organizations that are leading the initiative, but there are multiple members and organizations that are a part of the initiative overall. And so each group is responsible for developing different materials and tools that are of use to the larger community working on these initiatives. And some of these tools are already available and some are currently ongoing in development. Overall, we have 229 members from 78 organizations. Next slide, please. So I wanted to focus a little bit on what is available now and what's coming soon, because this may be most interesting to people. And these resources listed here are available on IRH's website. The link is located below. And soon they'll probably also be located on the Align platform. We have a social norms background reader that summarizes a lot of the research on social norms to bring us up to date on where we are. We have a guiding social norms conceptual framework that was developed out of the theory group's collaborative effort to think about how we holistically look at social norms, both within the community level, but the other institutional factors that are of interest and importance to addressing social norms. We have a top 20 social norms resources brief that just highlights some key reading for somebody who wanted to dive into social norms and didn't know where to start. We have attributes of normative change interventions. That was a lit review that I referenced in the talk that looks at what are the common elements of normative change interventions and what's important to think about in designing a program. We have a costing of social norms interventions primer, and we will be holding a webinar to share our experiences in developing and using this soon. And lastly, we have a social norms diagnostic, which is a background reader, and soon we will be coming out with a social norms exploration guide and toolkit. And this is something that is developed, again, cross-organizationally with different groups that have been working on identifying social norms and diagnosing them and using them to design programs. And we're now getting close to the phase where we're ready to pilot it. And we've been identifying and are still looking to identify additional organizations that want to try this in their work and see how useful it is for them in identifying the norms of interest and then designing programs. So it's something, if people are interested, they can always reach out to us about. And then you can see the list of other resources that are soon to come. So next slide, please. And so here is just some contact information. If you're interested in joining Collaborative, it's a rolling effort, so people can join at any time. And get access to resources if they want, or just stay updated on what's going on, or become more active in any of the 3 communities, you can email via SETA. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caroline and Anjali. I'm going to start with some questions that we've had from the audience. So you've talked, both your kind of the slides on the Align and Learning Initiative have highlighted different tools that are available. One question we have from the audience is, do you have any specific tool that you can recommend to programmers in measuring social norm? If there's any tool that you came across, if you had to give somebody advice, you want to measure the impact of your programs on social norms, what tools would you advise them to use? Let's say, Caroline, if you could give us your opinion on that, and then we can move on to Anjali.
Hi, I'm sorry, I lost connectivity, so I've only just come back and I haven't heard the last 5 minutes.
No worries. The question was from the audience was if there is any specific tool for measuring change that you would recommend to, for example, let's say community-based organizations who are implementing social norm programs and they want to measure the impact that their intervention is having. Can you recommend a simple tool for them to use? Or if you came across some interesting tools, I know you've highlighted some in your presentation, but if there is one that has your preference, which one would it be?
Yeah, I've got some views on the tools. I think, and I think Anjali may be better placed than I to answer this, but I think a lot of the tools for measuring norm change are very overly complicated and quite difficult to implement. And I think there are some simpler tools in development at the moment. I've certainly been talking to a few individuals from the Learning Collaborative, particularly on the monitoring and evaluation and the scale up groups, who are trying to develop toolkits that I think will be easier for people to use. At the community level, if you're looking at norm change, where you're looking at individuals' attitudes, the questions that have been used, which are asking people what they think other people think they should be doing to try and get a sense of the community attitudes, are actually quite complicated to do cross-culturally, to actually translate into different languages, to understand how that works. And so some of the feedback that I've heard is that it's very difficult to use those types of tools. But there are attitudinal questions that can be used that I think are much simpler to get a sense of whether people are thinking differently. And again, Anjali may be much better placed than I am to talk to those, but I think there are tools under development. So I'd urge people to check back into the Learning Collaborative and to the Align platform over the coming few months, because we'll certainly be sharing tools as we find them coming to use, and we'll be sharing existing tools as well.
Great, thanks. Anjali, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, I agree with Caroline. I think a lot of the tools are quite complicated, both cross-culturally and then just also in terms of the resources and time needed to ask a range of questions about different groups and power holders. It becomes quite complex. And I know that there are various efforts that are in place, for example, using vignettes as a way to capture a culturally relevant situation or story and then build out questions on that are showing some promise in looking at social norms change. I don't think that there's necessarily a state-of-the-art way that is being recommended. One of the things that the measurement community and the Learning Collaborative is doing has been a literature review and reaching out to different groups and organizations working on social norms to collect the variety of tools that they're using and to review them and see what challenges they've had in implementing them, what have been the strengths, and they soon will be coming out with a compendium on the state-of-the-art normative change diagnostic and measurement methods. So this is something to keep an eye out for. It will be available through the Learning Collaborative and I believe through Align as well. So it's something that we are all trying to work towards, but I don't think that there's one key tool or resource that is highly recommended at this point.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. Another question that is coming from the audience is around time. So we all know that, norm change take times, but the question asks, but how do we know how much time is needed? How do we know, well, this is enough, I can measure the impact now? Tricky question, I know. So I don't know, let's say, Caroline, you can start, and then we'll move over to Anjali.
Yeah, that is tricky. And I think a lot of these programs that we do, we're forced by many aspects outside our control, such as donor funding cycles, etc., to work within relatively short timeframes. When we know that even educational programs, you have a cohort going through school, you need at least 7 years to see if anything's going to change. So we are forced into far too short timeframes. Having said that, I think things can change quite quickly, and often through influences that may be outside of our control or unanticipated. So I don't think there is a time frame specific, a generalizable time frame. I think it's specific to different contexts. One aspect, though, where I think if you're working on programming, your work would be extremely valued is if you can secure follow-up evaluations. So beyond the life of the project, that's very, very rarely done. And we do a lot of review work of evaluations, and there are virtually no programs. I mean, I think there's 1 or 2 in every 100 that revisit, even within 1 year, and certainly not within 5 years, to see what's going on. So it makes it very difficult to understand the timeframes for change. Often people do a 3 or 5 year program, and then that's it. And they may be told their program hasn't been that successful, but they haven't allowed enough time, maybe they haven't revisited, or even the program that's rated as successful, if you go back in 3 years, what's happened? Have we all lapsed back? So I think that longer time frame, however you might be able to persuade, if you're working with donors or other actors, to actually have a long time frame is very important.
Okay, thanks. Anjali, would you like to give us your thoughts on, how much time, or if there is? Obviously, it's a tricky question. Caroline just highlighted it's really difficult to say, well, you need to do an intervention of that many years, and then you'll be able to measure social norms. But she has also highlighted the fact that you need, at least 3 to 5 years. The longer, the better, really. What are your thoughts? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's especially tricky because, part of norm change is looking at what's going on in the community and working with local groups and individuals, but it's also building into what's going on institutionally and in cross sectors. And so efforts at the community also need to be complemented by other efforts. And so trying to measure and monitor and support all of that change at once becomes quite tricky when you're looking at program impact. So I don't know if there is an ideal time, but I think it also emphasizes then it's important to monitor on the ground what shifts in behavior or attitudes or collective thoughts are taking place, and maybe use that as a way to supplement an understanding of what potentially is moving towards an impact, and that both maybe quantitatively and qualitative assessments periodically could help supplement our understanding of the process of change and trying to get a better understanding of time to change or what supports are necessary at different points in time.
Okay, thanks. Another question that came in was, how do norms affect age of marriage? Let's start with Anjali this time.
I think if I understand the question correctly, I think norms can influence what we consider to be an acceptable change of marriage, so that our age of marriage. So I think Caroline presented a good overview of what factors influence the ways in which people think about marriage and adult and girls and boys development, and that includes the ways in which we understand puberty and how puberty signals perhaps a readiness for being reproductive and getting married and starting to have children, and whether that norm, if we can shift that norm, how that might influence what is considered an acceptable age of marriage. Similarly, if we see norms around gender equity and how that might influence whether we invest in girls' education. And so whether if we started to shift those norms, then investing in girls' education and economic empowerment might become more important, and that might simultaneously then shift what is considered an acceptable age of marriage, because there's reason to invest in a girl at a younger age, whereas before the reason was really focused on marriage and giving her opportunities to be developing her family. So I think there's many places in which norms can influence what people consider to be an acceptable age of marriage.
Thanks. Caroline, would you like to add anything else to that?
I think that's an interesting question in this webinar, because I think it reflects how people are thinking in many different ways about what drives early marriage. So for some people, they might think, actually, this is all about the economy. This is about the fact that girls are expensive to keep at home. They're going to marry when they're 14. So actually, we need to marry them out of the house at an early age and not invest in them. And so, the economic driver of will drive girls into early marriage, or maybe it's a very poor family and they can't afford to feed that many children, and therefore early marriage for girls is one way of coping with poverty. It might also be that some people think, well, it's just because there's not schooling available. So what else do you do with a girl? The school isn't providing facilities. It's not a good place for girls. And therefore, it's because of the lack of schooling that girls are getting married earlier. And therefore, your solution, if you think like that, is that we'll provide the schooling for girls in remote areas and the age of marriage will drop. But what we've found is that those types of material benefits don't necessarily drive down the age of marriage. So you might pull people out of poverty, you might provide schooling, and still girls are getting married early. And why is that? That's because of the norms. That's because people are thinking, actually, that it's right that girls should get married at 12. And that's embedded in their belief system, that's embedded in what they think is right for girls. And that's not just dependent on the economic drivers or the schooling drivers or the legal norms. It's actually in people's minds and belief system that girls should marry at 12, and that we also have to address that. The economic drivers are very important, the schooling is very important, but people's beliefs are very important, and the local rules are very important. And that's how norms affect the age of marriage.
Thank you. The next question is, how much evidence is there about the impact of engaging religious leaders and other community stakeholders? Caroline, you can take the first shot at this one? Is there any evidence that, that actually engaging religious leaders and community stakeholders has an impact on child marriage prevalence?
Yeah, I think there is. We haven't done a collation of that evidence, and actually I think that's a very good idea. So thank you for that question. I think it would be very useful to review a lot of projects that specifically target religious leaders and to see what the impact is, because from what I've read, which is just one or two projects, I think there is good evidence that engaging the leaders and engaging men in particular, whether they're leaders or not, they're certainly seen as higher status in many communities than women, is very important in changing norms. So Anjali may have more specific insights, but I do think that I certainly know of some cases that where that's been proved to be important, and I'm going to put that on my list for possibly looking in more detail at a wider range of cases. I think that would be very useful.
Thanks, Caroline, for your response. Anjali, would you like to come in on that one? Anjali's still with us.
Can you hear me? Yes?
We can hear you now, yes.
Okay. I was saying I'm not actually sure how solid the evidence is. So I'd be interested in seeing what if Caroline's group does do a review. I'd be interested in seeing what comes out of it. I know in the sexual and reproductive health field, when we're looking at adolescents, that is something that we're very interested in. Is what is the role of faith leaders and how does it shift norms? And that is something that we're trying to dig deeper into in some of our programming. But yeah, I'm not sure within child marriage.
Okay. Another question that I have is, so as you know, a lot of our members are community-based organizations, and so what advice would you give them in developing programming that address social norms? So when they design their program, is there some kind of top tips that you would give them to help them basically design better projects? I don't know, Caroline, would you like to take a first shot at that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm not a program design person. However, and I think maybe Anjali referred to this in her presentation, involving the community in the design of the program, I would think is absolutely fundamental. And from what I know of the work on community development and participatory development, if you want success at the end, then you need to involve the key stakeholders at the beginning, because they are the people who can actually provide the greatest guidance of how far you can go, because you may want to go a lot further than is possible, and what they want to see change. And so working alongside key stakeholders, it seems to me to be imperative.
Okay, and Anjali, would you like to give us your advice for CBOs trying to design norm change programs?
Sure. I think the first, I think it's important to look at norms within a larger environment of other factors that might be driving behavior. And so, like we're talking a lot about multi-sectoral, multi-component interventions and cross-sectoral efforts, I think it's important from the beginning to keep that framework in mind as you're developing a normative change intervention. So an intervention might pull on other supplementary strategies that look at individual level supports or more institutional supports to help facilitate that change. I also think it's important to diagnose the norms, so to understand what norms are in place and which norms are most critical for you to address for the behavior of interest, because perhaps not all norms are important, and many norms are related to multiple behaviors. And so it's important to just be clear about what you're trying to do so that when you're moving along in program design, you can make sure you're programming for what your intention is. And then like Caroline said, I think involving the community throughout the process, including people that hold power and hold the norm and behavior in place, but also people that are supporting shifts of norms and shifts of behavior is critical to achieving, it's critical to think about in developing programs.
Okay, thanks. I've got another question, one last question that we will take because I'm conscious of time, and it's from Margaret Bonges. I'm going to try to read it out, but if you want to come in, Margaret, to explain a bit more, let us know. So the question, so how do you explain loopholes in laws around minimum age of marriage in the UK and the US, especially when we see that they're not frequently used? So, so for example, people say that, in the UK and the US, you can marry with parental consent. So how do you explain this within the concept of this presentation? I don't know if the question is clear.
I think I understand it. I mean, just referring to what I know about the UK situation and a little in the States, I mean, perhaps it comes slightly from the fact that you would expect, a country like the UK to have very solid laws around marriage. And, the fact is that every country has a different contextual environment. So in the UK, it is legal to get married at 16 with parental consent and at 18 without parental consent. And I think that reflects the the local culture here. In some states in the US, and forgive me because I can't remember exactly which one, I believe amongst some communities, it's legal with parental consent to get married at a very young age. And I was personally quite shocked when I found that out. But again, it reflects the local culture and context. So, I think around the world, we're all in various stages of addressing women and girls' rights. And, we will have our own context to work within as well. So these are complex mores in every country, and working out what is right and what is acceptable is part of the progression towards social justice.
Thanks, Caroline. Anjali, would you like to comment?
No, I think that captures it quite well.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the both of you for answering the questions and for giving really interesting presentations. I think I'm gonna wrap up now, just to highlighting some of the key messages. So we saw from the presentation that it's important to understand the norms that may influence child marriage in each context and each setting. So there's no kind of one rule fits all. It's also important to distinguish between attitude change, behavior change, and norm change. They're different things, and it's important to recognize which level of change our programs seek to change and be realistic about what change is possible, especially in constrained timeframes that we sometimes have, as Caroline said, sometimes donor requirements or fundings and so on. One thing that we know is that the evidence around community-oriented programming designed to shift social norm is extremely thin. We don't have much evidence of what works and what doesn't, so it's really important to try and rigorously document and measure change at this level, although we all know that isn't easy. And then I think what we've learned is also kind of reinforcing what came out of the previous webinar, was that we need to use multiple and complementary strategies rather than a single kind of or targeting one single group or one single strategy. So I think I'm going to close there. Just want to give people heads up on our second webinar. So this webinar was a lot about what the evidence says, what the literature says about social norms. In our next webinar, which will be next Thursday, 22 of February, we will dig in a bit more on the practical realities of implementing social norms programs. So we hope to see some of you then. All the questions which we didn't have time to answer, we will answer them online separately, and we will of course make the presentations of both speakers available in our resource centers. So thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you again soon. Bye.